My phone buzzed at 1 in the morning. A harsh, jarring sound that shattered the quiet of my estate. I answered it groggily. Detective Bradley was on the other end. He told me they had just found my 7-year-old grandson wandering alone near the interstate in the freezing rain. I let out a sharp sigh of annoyance and told the officer that was completely impossible. I told him my grandson was asleep in his bed right down the hall from me. The detective went dead silent for 3 long seconds. Then his voice cracked as he spoke. "Sir, he has your grandson's exact face." I threw off my blitz and marched down the hallway of my massive house to prove the cops wrong. But what I was about to discover that night would drag me into a living nightmare. If you are watching this story, take a deep breath. Hit the like button and subscribe, because what I found out completely shattered my reality. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is. Now let me tell you how my perfect life turned into absolute hell. My name is Harrison Mitchell. I am 71 years old. I am a retired structural engineer. I spent 40 long, hard years building a construction materials empire from absolute scratch. I sold my company a few years ago for tens of millions of dollars. I thought I had secured my family's future forever. My son Connor is 38 years old and works as a vice president at an investment fund. He is a man obsessed with appearances, luxury cars, and the illusion of a perfect life. His wife, Nicole, is a 36-year-old former real estate broker who lives for social status and country club dinners. But my greatest joy in this world has always been my 7-year-old grandson, Liam. After my wife Diane passed away 4 years ago, Liam became the center of my universe. I built my massive estate with plenty of guest rooms just so Connor and his family could visit often. They were supposedly on a romantic weekend getaway in Napa Valley, leaving Liam with me. So when the police called to tell me they found him on the highway, I was livid. I held the phone to my ear as I pushed open the heavy oak door of the guest bedroom. The soft glow of the nightlight illuminated the room. I walked over to this bed. I pulled the thick comforter back just a little. The boy was lying there, breathing softly and evenly. His dark blonde hair was messy against the pillow. His small chest rose and fell in a deep sleep. I brought the phone back to my mouth, feeling a surge of pure irritation. "I told you, officer." I growled softly so I would not wake the sleeping child. "My grandson is right here in my house. You have made a terrible mistake. Please do not call me again." "Sir, wait," Detective Bradley shouted through the speaker. "I just sent a photograph to your phone. Please look at it before you hang up. Please, Mr. Mitchell." I sighed heavily. I pulled the phone away from my ear and opened my messages. The screen lit up my face in the dark room. I stared at the photo the detective had just sent. My breath caught in my throat. My blood ran absolutely cold. The boy in the photo was wrapped in an emergency foil blanket, sitting on a bench inside a police station. His face was pale and streaked with dirt. He looked terrified. But that was not what made my heart stop beating. What made my heart stop was the fact that the boy in the photograph was entirely identical to the boy sleeping in the bed next to me. I zoomed in on the image with a trembling finger. The boy at the station had the exact same hazel eyes. He had the same slightly crooked smile line. And right below his left ear, I saw the identical crescent-shaped birthmark that my Liam had always had since the day he was born. I stared at the photo. Then I looked down at the boy sleeping in the bed, then back at the photo. It was physically impossible. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. My structural engineering mind was trained to seek logic and patterns, but there was zero logic here. "Detective," I whispered into the phone. "Where are you right now?" "I am at the county precinct on 5th Avenue, the detective answered. "I will be there in 20 minutes, I told him. "Do not let anyone near that boy until I arrive." I hung up the phone. My hands were shaking so badly, I almost dropped the device on the floor. I looked at the boy in the bed one more time. A wave of profound, terrifying unease washed over my entire body. If the boy in the photograph was my real grandson, then who the hell was sleeping under my roof? I backed out of the room silently. I carefully closed the heavy oak door. Then I did something I had never done in my entire life. I locked the bedroom door from the outside using my master key. I could not risk this strange imposter waking up and wandering around my house while I was gone. I rushed to my master bedroom and grabbed my thick winter coat. The storm outside was raging. Lightning flashed across the massive windows of my estate, illuminating the dark, empty hallways. I ran down the grand staircase, skipping steps despite my 71 years of age. I grabbed my car keys from the table near the front entrance. I bolted out into the freezing rain. The cold water hit my face like tiny needles, but I barely felt it. My mind was spinning 1,000 miles an hour, trying to piece together a puzzle that made absolutely no sense. I climbed into my heavy pickup truck and started the engine. The tires screeched against the wet driveway as I accelerated toward the heavy iron gates of my property. The drive to the police station felt like it took an eternity. The highway was completely dark and empty, except for the relentless downpour. The windshield wipers beat back and forth in a frantic rhythm matching the pounding in my chest. I thought about my son Connor. I thought about his extravagant lifestyle. I thought about the hundreds of thousands of dollars he had borrowed from me over the last 3 years to fund what he called investment opportunities. I had always suspected he was living far beyond his means, but I never pushed the issue because I wanted to maintain family peace. Now, as I sped through the blinding rain, a terrible, sickening suspicion began to take root in the back of my mind. What if Connor was involved in this nightmare? What if his romantic weekend getaway with Nicole was just a cover story for something truly dark and incredibly twisted? I pressed the gas pedal down. The heavy engine of my truck roared over the relentless sound of the torrential rain battering the windshield. The slick asphalt of the highway reflected the harsh yellow glare of the streetlights, but my focus remained entirely locked on the road ahead. I am not a man who panics easily. You do not build a massive commercial construction empire from the ground up by losing your head when a sudden crisis hits. I had spent over 4 decades managing catastrophic supply chain failures, labor union strikes, and devastating economic crashes. I knew exactly how to compartmentalize my emotions. I knew how to breathe through the chaos. But as I pulled into the visitor parking lot of the county police precinct, my hands were gripping the leather steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached with a dull, throbbing pain. I threw the transmission into park, leaving the engine running, and stepped out into the freezing storm. The icy rain soaked through my heavy winter coat instantly, but I barely registered the biting cold against my skin. I marched up the concrete steps and pushed through the heavy glass doors of the precinct. The air inside was stale and thick, smelling faintly of cheap floor wax and old burnt coffee. The fluorescent tube lights overhead hummed with a constant, irritating buzz. I walked straight toward the front desk. My wet boots squeaked against the linoleum floor, drawing the immediate attention of the duty sergeant. But before I could even open my mouth to demand answers, my eyes locked onto a tiny, trembling figure sitting in the far corner of the room. He was huddled on a hard wooden bench, wrapped tightly in a crinkly silver emergency foil blanket that rustled with his every breath. My breath hitched sharply in my throat. It was the exact same boy from the photograph the detective had texted me. I took a slow, deliberate step forward. My logical engineering mind struggled violently to process what my eyes were seeing. If I had not personally locked the heavy oak door to the guest bedroom in my own house just 20 minutes ago, I would have sworn on my very life that this child was my grandson Liam. He had the same fine sandy blonde hair plastered to his forehead with sweat and rainwater. I had the exact same delicate jawline, and there right below his left ear was that distinct dark crescent-shaped birthmark. I waited for him to look up and shout my name. I waited for him to throw off that silver foil blanket, run across the room, and yell, "Pop, pop," like he always did whenever he was frightened by a thunderstorm. But that did not happen. When his exhausted hazel eyes finally met mine, there was absolutely no recognition in them. There was only raw, unadulterated terror. He gasped out loud, scrambling backward on the wooden bench until his small spine hit the painted cinder block wall. Then, with a frantic, panicked movement, he slid off the bench and scrambled underneath the heavy steel desk, curling himself into a tight little ball of pure fear. I was looking at me as if I were a monster. My heart physically ached inside my chest. I dropped down to one knee on the cold linoleum floor, completely ignoring the sharp, familiar pain in my aging joints. I needed to calm him down before his panic escalated any further. I took a deep breath and deliberately lowered the pitch of my voice. Back when I was actively running my construction company, I used a very specific psychological tactic during hostile corporate takeovers or highly explosive board meetings. When the conference room descended into screaming and chaos, I would never raise my voice to match their volume. Instead, I would speak in a low, steady, unwavering baritone. It projected absolute authority and calm control. It forced everyone else in the room to stop panicking and listen to me. I tried to use that exact same tone right now. I kept my large hands perfectly still, resting them flat on my knees, so I would not appear threatening in any way. I told him he was completely safe. I told him my name was Harrison, and that no one in this building was ever going to let anyone hurt him again. I promised him I was just there to help take him home. I poured every single ounce of warmth and reassurance I had into my words. But my corporate boardroom trick failed entirely. It did not soothe him at all. If anything, my deep echoing voice made his small frame tremble even harder. He pulled his knees tightly to his chest, burying his face deep into his arms. He was completely broken. I slowly leaned forward, trying to get a better look at him under the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lighting. As the silver foil blanket slipped slightly off his thin, shivering shoulders, I noticed details that made the blood run absolutely cold in my veins. His thin wrists were partially exposed. All around his fragile, pale skin, I saw the unmistakable dark purple and yellow rings of deeply faded bruises. They were perfectly symmetrical. They looked exactly like the brutal marks left behind by heavy medical restraints or tightly fastened zip ties. My stomach churned with a sudden, sickening dread. But that was not the worst of it. The oversized blue hospital scrub the police had given him hung loosely around his narrow neck, revealing the upper portion of his chest. Right over his delicate collarbone was a thick, raised surgical scar. It was dark pink and looked freshly healed. Right next to it was a small, perfectly circular indentation in his flesh. I recognized it immediately because my late wife had one just like it. It was the healed entry point of an intravenous medical port. The exact kind of they surgically implant in patients who require constant aggressive chemical treatments or heavy daily sedation. This poor child had not just been lost in the rain. He had been clinically and systematically abused for a very long time. A fierce protective rage flared up hot and bright inside my chest. I stood up, planting my boots firmly on the ground. I turned toward the police officers standing behind the counter, fully ready to demand that they call an ambulance and the federal authorities immediately to intervene. Before I could even formulate the angry sentence, the heavy double-glass doors of the precinct burst open behind me. A violent blast of freezing wind and rain swept directly into the quiet lobby. I turned around, fully expecting to see more police officers arriving on the scene. Instead, I saw my son Preston and his wife Monica. They stumbled into the brightly lit room, breathing heavily as if they had been running. They were completely soaked from the raging storm outside, but it was their faces that instantly caught my attention. They were both as pale as ghosts, their eyes wide with absolute frantic panic. They were supposed to be sleeping in an exclusive luxury resort in Napa Valley, thousands of miles away on the sunny West Coast. Yet here they were, standing in a local county police precinct at 2 a.m, dressed in dark, hurried clothing. Preston immediately locked eyes with me. For a tiny fraction of a second, I saw a flash of pure, unadulterated terror cross his face before he quickly masked it with a practiced look of desperate concern. He did not ask me why I was there. He did not run to the front desk to ask the officers what had happened. Instead, he walked directly toward me and purposefully positioned his tall body squarely between me and the desk where the trembling boy was hiding. Monica stayed right behind him, clutching her expensive leather handbag tightly against her chest, like a protective shield. Her eyes darted nervously toward the cops, and then down to the boy hiding in the shadows. Preston held up his hands in a gesture of surrender and looked directly at the duty sergeant. "Officer," he said, his voice perfectly steady, but laced with a heavy, dramatic sorrow. "There has been a terrible mistake tonight. I apologize for the confusion. This boy is not Liam." He looked back at me, his gaze hardening into a cold, calculated stare. "This is our secret." Preston's words hung heavily in the cold, sterile air of the police precinct. Before I could even begin to process the sheer absurdity of his statement, Monica let out a sudden, piercing sob. She collapsed onto her knees, right there on the damp linoleum floor, burying her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook violently as she wept. It was a theatrical display of raw maternal devastation. Any normal person watching her would have felt an immediate rush of sympathy. The duty sergeant stepped out from behind the counter, his posture softening instantly. Preston placed a comforting hand on his wife's shaking back. He looked up at me with eyes that appeared completely shattered. He reached out and gently gripped my arm, guiding me a few steps away from the officers and the trembling child under the desk. His grip was tight. I could feel the nervous sweat on his palms seeping through the fabric of my wet winter coat. I demanded to know what on earth he was talking about. I demanded to know why this child was a perfect copy of my grandson. Preston took a deep, trembling breath. He looked me straight in the eyes and delivered a flawless, emotional speech. He told me that this boy was named Julian. He said Julian was Liam's twin brother. My mind violently rejected the information. I told him he was insane. I was there throughout the entire pregnancy. I had paid for the top-tier private doctors. There was only one baby on every ultrasound. But Preston shook his head slowly, wiping a single tear from his cheek. He lowered his voice so the police officers could not hear the intimate details of our family tragedy. He reminded me of the terrible events from 7 years ago. He reminded me of the exact month Liam was born. It was the darkest period of my entire life. I had suffered a massive widowmaker heart attack just 2 weeks before Monica went into labor. I was lying in a medically induced coma in the intensive care unit hooked up to a dozen machines. The doctors had told my late wife Diane that I had less than a 10% chance of waking up. If I did wake up, any sudden shock or emotional trauma would trigger a secondary cardiac event and kill me instantly. Preston kept his eyes locked on mine as he spun his web. He claimed that Monica actually went into premature labor and delivered twins. But while Liam was perfectly healthy, Julian was born with catastrophic complications. Preston said Julian suffered from severe cognitive deficits and massive physical deformities. The doctors allegedly told them the boy would not live to see his first birthday. They said he would require 24-hour specialized medical care just to survive the month. Preston told me that Diane, my strong, fiercely protective Diane, made a unilateral decision right there in the delivery wing. She knew my heart was failing. She knew the devastating news of a dying grandson would absolutely end my life. So according to Preston, Diane swore him and Monica to absolute secrecy. They agreed to hide Julian from me and from the rest of the world to protect my fragile health. They supposedly placed the infant in an elite, discreet private medical facility located deep in the countryside. Preston claimed they had been secretly paying for Julian's astronomical medical bills out of their own pockets for the past 7 years. He said they visited him every single week, living a double life filled with unbearable silent grief. He framed himself as a tragic hero who had sacrificed his own peace of mind solely to keep his father alive. I stood there listening to his smooth, rehearsed cadence. It was the perfect, plausible lie. It painted Diane as a protective matriarch making a hard choice. It painted him and Monica as selfless martyrs, and it perfectly explained why the child was covered in medical scars and why he could not speak. Preston turned back toward the police officers. He raised his voice just enough for the sergeant to hear. He explained that Julian suffered from severe neurological episodes and must have somehow escaped the private care facility tonight, while the night nurses were changing shifts. He said Julian must have wandered onto the highway in a state of deep confusion. The officers bought the entire story without a single ounce of hesitation. It was the classic wealthy family hiding a tragic secret scenario. The duty sergeant nodded sympathetically, murmuring his condolences for their difficult situation. The tension in the precinct dissolved completely. The cops closed their notepads. They viewed Preston and Monica not as suspects, but as exhausted, desperate parents trying to manage an impossible medical burden. I watched the entire interaction in stunned silence. Part of me wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that my son was a good man doing his best in a terrible situation. I wanted to believe that Diane had orchestrated this painful secret strictly out of deep love for me. It was so much easier to accept a tragic medical secret than to entertain the dark, terrifying suspicions that were clawing at the edges of my rational mind. But then I looked back at the boy. The child they called Julian was still curled up tightly under the steel desk. He had not moved an inch. I was staring at Preston and Monica with a look of absolute primal dread. Monica wiped her flawlessly manicured hands across her dry cheeks. The dramatic sobbing had stopped as quickly as it had begun. She stood up, smoothing the wrinkles out of her expensive designer slacks. She put on a soft, trembling, motherly smile and slowly approached the desk. She knelt down on the linoleum floor, stretching both of her arms out toward the shivering child. "Oh, my sweet, brave boy," she cooed, her voice dripping with artificial honey. "Mommy is here now. Mommy is going to take you back to a warm, safe place." She reached her hand under the desk, attempting to grasp his thin, fragile arm. The second her manicured fingers brushed against his bruised skin, the boy erupted. He did not cry. He did not whimper. He lunged forward with the frantic speed of a cornered wild animal. He clamped his teeth down violently hard on the meaty part of Monica's hand. Monica let out a genuine blood-curdling shriek. She ripped her arm backward, stumbling against the tiled wall. The boy retreated deeper into the shadows under the desk, his chest heaving, his jaw clamped shut. Bright red blood immediately welled up on Monica's hand, dripping onto the pristine precinct floor. For one brief, fleeting second, the mask of the tragic, grieving mother completely shattered. Monica glared down at the traumatized child. Her face contorted into a snarl of pure, unadulterated hatred. It was a look of profound, menacing disgust. It was the exact kind of look you would give to a rabid dog that had just bitten you. It was a look a mother would never, ever give her disabled, suffering son. My stomach dropped. I knew then. Preston's words hung heavily in the cold, sterile air of the police precinct. Before I could process the sheer absurdity of his statement, Monica let out a sudden, piercing sob. She collapsed onto her knees on the damp linoleum floor, burying her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook violently as she wept. The duty sergeant stepped out from behind the wooden counter, his posture softening instantly as he watched her cry. Preston placed a comforting hand on his wife's shaking back. He slowly looked up at me with eyes that appeared completely shattered by grief. He gently gripped my arm, guiding me away from the concerned officers and the trembling child hiding under the desk. I demanded to know what on earth he was talking about. I demanded to know why this terrified child was a perfect copy of my beloved grandson. Preston took a deep, trembling breath. He looked me straight in the eyes and delivered a flawless, emotional speech. He told me that this fragile boy was named Julian. He said Julian was Liam's biological twin brother. My logical mind violently rejected the impossible information. I was there throughout the entire pregnancy, supporting them financially and emotionally. I had personally paid for the top-tier private doctors and the prenatal care available in the state. There was only one baby clearly visible on every single ultrasound image we ever saw, but Preston shook his head slowly, wiping a single stray tear from his cheek. He deliberately lowered his voice so the police officers standing nearby could not hear the intimate, devastating details of our supposed family tragedy. He reminded me of the terrible events from exactly 7 years ago. He reminded me of the specific month Liam was born into this world. I had suffered a massive widowmaker heart attack just 2 weeks before Monica went into premature labor. I was lying in a medically induced coma in the intensive care unit, hooked up to loud machines, fighting for every single breath. The leading cardiologists had explicitly told my late wife Diane that I had less than a 10% chance of waking up. They firmly warned her that any sudden shock or severe emotional trauma would instantly trigger a massive secondary cardiac event and kill me right there in the hospital bed. Preston kept his dark eyes locked firmly on mine as he spun his intricate web of lies. He claimed that Monica actually went into unexpected premature labor and delivered twin boys that stormy night. But while Liam was perfectly healthy, Julian was born with catastrophic and heartbreaking complications. Preston said Julian suffered from severe cognitive deficits and massive physical deformities that shocked the entire medical staff. The specialists allegedly told them the tiny boy would not live to see his first birthday. They supposedly said he would require 24-hour specialized intensive medical care just to survive his first month on Earth. Preston told me that Diane, my strong, fiercely protective Diane, made a unilateral and agonizing decision right there in the sterile delivery wing. She knew the devastating news of a dying, suffering grandson would absolutely end my fragile life. So according to Preston, Diane swore him and Monica to absolute permanent secrecy. They solemnly agreed to hide Julian from me and from the rest of the world forever simply to protect my failing health. They supposedly placed the fragile infant in an elite, discreet private medical facility located deep in the isolated countryside. Preston claimed they had been secretly paying for Julian's astronomical medical bills out of their own private pockets for the past 7 long years. He expertly framed himself as a selfless, tragic hero who had sacrificed his own peace of mind solely to keep his aging father alive. It beautifully painted Diane as a protective matriarch, making an incredibly hard, agonizing choice for the sake of love. It painted him and Monica as selfless, enduring martyrs who bore an invisible cross. And it perfectly explained why the shivering child was covered in horrific medical scars and why he could not speak a single word to the police. Preston turned back toward the sympathetic police officers. He raised his voice just enough for the duty sergeant to hear clearly. He explained that Julian suffered from severe neurological episodes and must have somehow escaped the secure private care facility tonight, while the night nurses were busy changing shifts. He said Julian must have wandered blindly onto the freezing highway in a state of deep, dangerous confusion. The officers bought the entire fabricated story without a single ounce of hesitation or critical doubt. It was the classic wealthy family hiding a tragic, unavoidable medical secret scenario. The duty sergeant nodded sympathetically, murmuring his sincere condolences for their incredibly difficult family situation. They viewed Preston and Monica not as potential suspects, but as exhausted, desperate parents trying to manage an impossible, heartbreaking medical burden. I wanted to believe that Diane had orchestrated this painful, necessary secret strictly out of deep, protective love for me. It was so much easier to accept a tragic medical secret than to entertain the dark, terrifying suspicions that were violently clawing at the edges of my rational mind. But then I slowly looked back at the boy. The child they casually called Julian was still curled up tightly under the cold steel desk. He had not moved a single inch since they walked in. He was staring directly at Preston and Monica with a chilling look of absolute primal dread. Monica wiped her flawlessly manicured hands across her dry porcelain cheeks. She stood up gracefully, smoothing the minor wrinkles out of her expensive designer slacks. She put on a soft, trembling, motherly smile and slowly approached the heavy desk. She knelt down gracefully on the hard linoleum floor, stretching both of her arms out warmly toward the violently shivering child. "Oh, my sweet, brave little boy," she cooed, her voice dripping with thick, artificial honey. "Mommy is here now, darling. Mommy is going to take you back to a warm, safe place where you belong." She reached her hand deep under the desk, attempting to firmly grasp his thin, fragile arm. The very second her manicured fingers brushed against his bruised purple skin, the boy violently erupted. He lunged forward with the frantic, explosive speed of a cornered wild animal fighting for survival. He clamped his teeth down violently hard on the meaty part of Monica's outstretched hand. Monica let out a genuine, piercing, blood-curdling shriek. She ripped her arm backward, stumbling heavily against the tiled wall behind her. The boy instantly retreated deeper into the dark shadows under the desk, his small chest heaving, his jaw clamped firmly shut in defiance. Bright red blood immediately welled up on Monica's injured hand, dripping steadily onto the pristine precinct floor. For one fleeting second, her carefully constructed mask shattered. Monica glared down at the child, her face violently contorted into a terrifying snarl of pure, unadulterated hatred. It was a look a mother would never give her suffering son. My stomach dropped completely. I knew then. This entire tragic story was nothing but an absolute, complete fabrication. This entire tragic story was nothing but an absolute, complete fabrication. I kept my face perfectly blank, hiding the sudden, violent storm of realization tearing through my mind. Preston nervously cleared his throat and stepped toward the desk again. He gently told the police officers that they would be taking Julian home immediately so the poor boy could rest. He reached out to grab the child. I stepped directly into his path, blocking his reach. My imposing frame easily dwarfed my son. I used the exact same commanding tone I had used to secure multi-million-dollar commercial real estate deals. I told Preston that absolutely no one was leaving this police precinct until both boys were safely under my roof. I calmly informed him that my sprawling estate had top-tier medical security systems and plenty of space for the child to recover. Preston immediately began to protest. His voice was high and tight with rising panic. He stammered that Julian needed his specialized medication and that my house would be too overwhelming for his fragile condition. I cut him off smoothly but firmly. I reminded Preston that I paid for his house, his cars, and his entire extravagant lifestyle. I told him if this child was truly my grandson, I was going to spend the weekend getting to know him. My tone left absolutely no room for debate. The police officers nodded in agreement, stating that my massive, secure estate was the best place for a traumatized child to recover. Defeated and visibly sweating, Preston finally agreed. We drove back to my property in tense, heavy silence. I did not sleep a single second that night. I sat in the leather armchair in my dark study, listening to the heavy rain pounding against the glass windows. My mind was rapidly sorting through decades of memories, looking for any subtle clue I might have missed. When the morning sun finally broke through the gray clouds, I walked into my expansive, formal dining room. My trusted housekeeper had already prepared a massive breakfast spread, filling the room with the warm, comforting scent of roasted coffee and melted butter. There were fresh fruits, scrambled eggs, crispy bacon, and a large silver tray filled with colorful imported French macarons. I stood by the grand window waiting. A few minutes later, the heavy oak doors swung open. The healthy boy who had been sleeping soundly in my guest room the entire night bounded into the dining room. He looked bright, energetic, and completely untouched by the dramatic events of the previous night. He ran straight toward me, flashing a wide, familiar smile, and cheerfully yelled, "Good morning, Pop, Pop." He wrapped his arms around my waist, hugging me tightly. I stiffened slightly, but forced myself to gently pat his back. I looked down at his perfectly healthy face, his bright hazel eyes, his flawless skin. Everything about his physical appearance screamed that he was my beloved grandson. But the cold, sickening dread in the pit of my stomach refused to disappear. A moment later, the dining room doors opened again. The traumatized boy they called Julian slowly crept into the room. He looked exhausted and terrified. He quietly took a seat at the extreme far end of the long mahogany table, keeping his eyes fixed nervously on the healthy boy standing next to me. I decided to conduct a silent test. I needed to see how the healthy boy would react to something only my true flesh and blood would understand. I smiled warmly and gestured toward the large silver tray resting on the center of the dining table. I told the healthy boy that he could choose any pastry he wanted before we sat down to eat our eggs. The boy's eyes lit up with unadulterated childish greed. He immediately abandoned my side and ran eagerly toward the massive spread of food. I ignored the fresh fruit and the warm bacon, his eyes locked on the sugar, reaching directly for the colorful French macarons. His small fingers hovered over the different flavors before he excitedly picked up a bright green one. It was a pistachio and crushed peanut macaron. He held it up, admiring the sweet, sticky filling. Then he turned around and ran right back to me. He held the bright green pastry high up in the air, pushing it directly toward my face. He laughed a loud, carefree laugh and playfully demanded that I take the first bite. He shouted that I had to eat it because it was his absolute favorite flavor. He pressed the peanut macaron dangerously close to my lips, giggling uncontrollably as he tried to force-feed me the sweet treat as a silly morning joke. I froze still. My heart slammed against my ribs like a sledgehammer. 3 years ago, when my real grandson was only 4 years old, we had visited a local bakery downtown. I had accidentally consumed a small pastry cross contaminated with heavy peanut oil. I am deathly allergic to peanuts. I went into severe catastrophic anaphylactic shock right there on the bakery floor in front of his tiny, horrified eyes. I had collapsed, gasping desperately for air as my throat swelled shut. My vision had faded to black as the sheer panic of impending death took over my mind. The paramedics had arrived just in time to save my life with a high-dose epinephrine injection. Since that deeply traumatizing day, my real grandson treats peanuts like deadly toxic poison. He religiously checks every single food label. He constantly asks waiters if there are nuts in the kitchen. He would never ever offer me a peanut pastry, let alone try to playfully force it into my mouth as a joke. The healthy boy, standing in front of me, laughing and pushing the peanut macaron against my tightly closed lips, had absolutely no idea. He was a perfect physical copy, but he lacked the core memories that defined my true grandson. I kept my mouth clamped firmly shut, staring down at the healthy boy in sheer horror. Before I could reach and knock the dangerous pastry from his hands, a sudden violent blur of motion caught my attention from the far side of the room. The traumatized boy, the one Preston and Monica adamantly claimed was the hidden brain-damaged twin, Julian, had suddenly vaulted out of his heavy wooden chair. He did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. He dove wildly across the massive oak dining table, knocking over crystal juice glasses and expensive porcelain plates in his frantic path. He launched his small battered body directly between me and the healthy boy, ignoring the sharp pain of his own bruised ribs. With a look of absolute primal panic, he aggressively swatted the peanut macaron out of the healthy boy's hand, sending it flying across the room where it smashed against the wall. The traumatized boy landed hard on the floor, gasping for breath. He immediately scrambled to his feet and stood protectively in front of me, holding his small trembling arms out wide to shield me from the peanuts. His eyes were wide with sheer terror, but his desperate protective stance was undeniable. He looked up at me, his chest heaving, his bruised wrists shaking. He could not speak, but his actions screamed the absolute truth. This broken, bruised child was my real grandson. I stood frozen in the formal dining room, staring down at the broken pieces of the pistachio macaron scattered across the polished hardwood floor. The traumatized boy was still standing fiercely in front of me, panting heavily, his hands balled into tight, trembling fists. He was waiting for the dangerous threat to pass. The healthy boy, who had just cheerfully tried to feed me the deadly pastry, was looking back and forth between us with an expression of mild confusion and slight annoyance. He casually muttered a brief apology for dropping the expensive food, but there was absolutely no comprehension in his bright hazel eyes. He simply did not understand what had just happened. But I understood. I understood with a horrifying crystal-clear certainty that completely shattered the foundation of my reality. The bruised, silent child guarding my legs was my true flesh and blood. He was the real Liam. I needed to get them both out of my sight immediately, before my boiling rage bled through my carefully composed facade. I called out for my trusted housekeeper, Mrs. Gable. She hurried into the room, wiping her hands on her apron. I instructed her to take both boys to the west wing of the estate to play in the indoor pool area and to watch them closely. I ordered her not to let either of them out of her sight for a single second. Once they were safely escorted down the corridor, I turned around and walked briskly toward my private study. I stepped inside the heavily soundproofed room and firmly closed the solid mahogany doors behind me. I turned the brass lock until it clicked loudly. I was completely alone. My suspicion, which had been a creeping dread all night, was now a raging, uncontrollable fire burning inside my chest. Preston had looked me right in the eye at the police station and delivered a flawless, emotional monologue about a secret, deformed twin brother named Julian. He had callously invoked the memory of my late wife, Diane, to manipulate my lingering grief and to shield his elaborate lie from further scrutiny. But Preston had made one massive, fatal miscalculation. He had forgotten exactly who his mother was. Diane was not just a loving, dedicated matriarch. Before she retired, she had been the lead forensic accountant for my commercial construction empire. She possessed a brilliant, razor-sharp mind and an absolute obsession with meticulous organization. She documented every single detail of her daily life with a clinical, unyielding precision. She kept physical records of everything from minor grocery receipts to major medical appointments. I walked over to the painting hanging directly behind my massive leather desk. I carefully removed the wooden frame from the wall, revealing a hidden wall safe. I punched in the 6-digit access code and pulled the steel door open. Inside, resting quietly on the shelf, was Diane's personal medical lockbox. It was a steel container where she kept all of her most sensitive documents. I pulled the box out and placed it gently on the center of my desk. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me 3 separate attempts to slide the key into the lock. When the lid finally popped open, the familiar scent of vanilla and old paper drifted up, hitting me with a sudden wave of profound grief. But I forced the sadness down. I needed answers now. I began to sift frantically through the manila folders and the bound leather journals. I bypassed the folders containing her old cardiology reports and her estate planning notes. I was looking for one specific item. I dug much deeper into the very bottom of the lockbox until my fingers finally brushed against a diary. It was the personal journal she had kept meticulously during the specific year my grandson was born. I pulled it out and opened the cover. Her elegant and familiar handwriting neatly filled every single page, detailing her daily activities, her financial observations, and her thoughts. I quickly flipped through the heavy pages of the diary, anxiously scanning the exact dates written carefully at the top of each daily entry. I moved rapidly past the early months of the year, stopping abruptly when I reached the exact week of Monica's 20-week anatomy ultrasound scan. I took a deep breath and began to read her careful words. Diane had accompanied Monica and Preston to the fertility clinic that afternoon. She described the waiting room, the polite doctors, and the tension radiating from Preston the entire time they were there. Then I found the exact paragraph I was searching for. My tired eyes moved rapidly across the blue ink. Diane had carefully written down that the experienced ultrasound technician quickly found only one strong and absolutely perfect heartbeat. She wrote clearly that there was only a single little angel growing inside Monica, and that he was developing beautifully without any signs of complications. Diane wrote that Preston seemed strangely annoyed and frustrated during the drive home, complaining about the rigid financial stipulations I had placed on the generational trust fund. But she noted that she did not care about his complaints because her single little grandson was completely healthy and safe. One single heartbeat, a single perfect little angel, not two. There was no secret twin. There was no tragic hidden brother named Julian suffering from deformities in a remote rural clinic. The entire story, Preston had fed me at the police station, was a lie. He had stared directly into the eyes of his grieving father and weaponized his dead mother's memory to sell a sickening fabrication. My chest heaved as I stared down at the diary. The absolute horrifying reality of their betrayal finally crashed down heavily upon me. Preston and his wife Monica had somehow carelessly lost the real Liam. Or infinitely worse, they had simply and intentionally discarded him. And to cover their tracks to ensure that I did not stop the massive flow of money pouring out of my estate into their pockets, they had replaced him. They had found a healthy boy who happened to look exactly like my grandson, and they had simply slotted him into our lives like a cheap mechanical replacement part. They assumed I was too old, too tired, and too trusting to notice the subtle differences. They thought the identical face and the matching birthmark would be enough to easily fool a grieving and oblivious old man. But their plan had hit a massive complication. The real Liam, the traumatized child hiding under the blanket, had escaped wherever they had hidden him. He wandered out into the freezing storm and was picked up by the county police, ruining their facade. And now he was sitting in my house, terrified out of his mind, unable to speak. The dark truth was finally laid bare. The story of Julian was a complete sham. But as the rage settled into a cold, calculated focus, one terrifying question remained. If the silent boy hiding in my West Wing was the real Liam who knew about my deadly allergy, then who exactly was the healthy boy eating breakfast in my own house? I stood frozen in this formal dining room, staring down at the broken pieces of the pistachio macaron scattered across the polished hardwood floor. The traumatized boy was still standing fiercely in front of me, panting heavily, his hands balled into tight, trembling fists. He was waiting for the dangerous threat to pass. The healthy boy who had just cheerfully tried to feed me the deadly pastry was looking back and forth between us with an expression of mild confusion. He casually muttered a brief apology for dropping the expensive food, but there was absolutely no comprehension in his bright hazel eyes. He simply did not understand what had just happened. But I understood. I understood with a horrifying, crystal-clear certainty that completely shattered the foundation of my reality. The bruised, silent child guarding my legs was my true flesh and blood. He was the real Liam. I needed to get them both out of my sight immediately before my boiling rage bled through my carefully composed facade. I called out for my trusted housekeeper. She hurried into the room, wiping her hands on her apron. I instructed her to take both boys to the west wing of the estate, to play in the indoor pool area, and to watch them closely. I ordered her not to let either of them out of her sight for a single second. Once they were safely escorted down the corridor, I turned around and walked briskly toward my private study. I stepped inside the heavily soundproofed room and firmly closed the solid mahogany doors behind me. I turned the brass lock until it clicked loudly. I was completely alone. My suspicion, which had been a creeping dread all night, was now a raging fire burning inside my chest. Barely 2 hours after the incident, in the dining room, the heavy brass knocker on my front door echoed through the grand foyer. My trusted housekeeper opened the door to reveal my son, Preston. He stepped into the grand entryway, rubbing his eyes and running a hand through his perfectly styled hair to make himself look exhausted. I met him in the hallway and guided him directly into my private mahogany study. I offered him a seat in the plush leather armchair, positioned directly across from my massive desk. I sat down in my own chair, folding my hands carefully in my lap. I kept my breathing slow and even completely burying the violent storm of fury and betrayal that was screaming inside my chest. Preston let out a long, trembling sigh that sounded entirely rehearsed. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and looked at me. "Dad," he began, his voice thick with fake emotion. "I do not know how to say this without sounding like an absolute failure of a father." He paused dramatically, waiting for me to offer a word of comfort. I simply nodded, encouraging him to continue his performance. He swallowed hard and launched into his carefully constructed pitch. He told me that taking care of Julian in absolute secrecy for the past 7 years had completely drained their personal finances. He claimed that the elite private medical facility where they had been hiding the boy charged astronomical daily rates for his specialized care. He spun a tragic tale of endless medical debt, maxed-out credit cards, and a heavy silent burden that he and Monica had borne entirely on their own shoulders just to protect my failing heart. He wiped a dry eye and looked down at the floor. "Dad, we are completely bankrupt," he whispered, sounding utterly defeated. "We have mortgaged the house. We have drained our savings. And now the facility is threatening to discharge Julian because we can no longer keep up with the exorbitant payments. But I have found a permanent solution that will save his life and finally give him the peace he deserves." He leaned closer, his eyes wide and pleading. "There is an exclusive specialized neurological clinic in Geneva, Switzerland. They have groundbreaking treatments for his specific chromosomal condition. They can give him a real-life dad. But the admission fee and the specialized medical transport require a massive upfront payment. I need your help. I am begging you on my knees to help me save your grandson." I sat there listening to the venomous lies pouring out of his mouth. I asked him exactly how much money he needed. He did not even blink or hesitate before answering. He told me he needed me to unlock the $50 million generational trust fund I had established when the boys were supposedly born. He said he desperately needed an immediate transfer of $5 million by Monday morning to secure Julian's spot at the Swiss clinic before it was given to another patient. $5 million. It was an absolutely staggering sum of money to demand on a weekend's notice. He sat there, looking like a desperate, broken man, pleading for the life of his sick child. But as he brought his hand up to his face to wipe away another non-existent tear, the sleeve of his tailored designer jacket slid back slightly. The bright morning light, filtering through the large study windows, caught the gleaming polished gold of a heavy luxury watch resting snugly on his wrist. It was a custom Rolex, easily worth $60,000 on the current market. My eyes flicked from the extravagant timepiece back to his face. I nodded slowly, pretending to process the heavy emotional weight of his tragic request. I stood up from my desk and slowly walked over to the tall bay windows that overlooked the expansive circular driveway of my estate. I parted the heavy velvet curtains and looked outside. Parked carelessly across 2 spots in my pristine cobblestone driveway was a vehicle that completely shattered his entire narrative of financial ruin. It was a brand-new, custom-ordered Italian sports car, a gleaming, aggressive Ferrari with a sticker price well over $300,000. The sleek aerodynamic lines and the custom matte black paint job practically screamed massive disposable wealth. A man who is truly drowning in crippling medical debt does not drive a $300,000 custom Ferrari. A father who has supposedly mortgaged his home and drained his life savings to keep his disabled son alive does not wear a $60,000 gold Rolex to a morning meeting. I was standing in my study begging for $5 million while dripping in extravagant luxury. The sheer audacity of his greed was absolutely breathtaking. He was using the bruised, traumatized child as a convenient, tragic prop to extort a massive fortune. The rage I felt almost blinded me. But I knew that if I confronted him right now, he would immediately panic and destroy evidence. I needed to play the fool. I turned away from the window. I walked back over to Preston. I reached out and placed my hand firmly on his shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Of course, son. I will sign the paperwork on Monday." As Preston turns away, I see him silently fist-pump the air in victory. That gesture was the final nail in the coffin of my denial. It was pure predatory triumph. He thought he had manipulated his grieving father into handing over a massive fortune. I stood still watching through the crack in the mahogany doors as my son strode down the hallway. His posture had completely changed. The defeated shoulders of a broken father were entirely gone. He walked with the arrogant swagger of a man who had won the lottery. I heard the front door open and click shut. I walked to the tall bay windows and watched his custom black Ferrari roar to life. The aggressive engine echoed across the cobblestone driveway as he sped away, leaving my estate gates behind. He left his supposed sick child behind without a single backward glance, without asking to say goodbye. My heart felt like a heavy block of lead. I turned away from the window and let out a shaky breath. The silence of my massive house felt deafening. I knew exactly what I needed to do next. I needed to see the boy. Not the healthy imposter who was currently playing video games under the watchful eye of my housekeeper. I needed to see the traumatized child who had thrown himself across the dining table to save my life. I walked slowly down the corridor toward the guest wing. My mind drifted back to a memory from 4 years ago when my real grandson was just 3 years old. We were spending the summer at my coastal estate in South Carolina. A massive, unexpected hurricane had rolled in off the Atlantic Ocean in the middle of the night. The thunder was absolutely deafening, violently shaking the foundation. The lightning illuminated the dark rooms with harsh, terrifying flashes of white light. My grandson had been completely inconsolable. He was hiding deep inside my closet, burying his tiny face in my winter coats, sobbing uncontrollably in pure terror. No amount of soft words or warm hugs could pull him out of his panic. I needed a way to break through his fear. I needed to give him a signal that meant he was completely safe, no matter how loud the storm raged outside. So I crawled into the dark closet and sat beside him on the floor. I gently tapped 2 times on the wooden doorframe. I whistled a soft 2-note melody. Then I held up my thumb right in front of his tear-streaked face. I told him it was our secret code. I explained that whenever he heard those 2 knocks and that soft whistle, it meant his pop-pop was standing guard and no monsters or storms could get past me. It became our secret language. Whenever he felt scared in a crowded room, I would just knock twice, whistle softly, and hold up my thumb. He would instantly calm down and mirror the thumbs up right back to me. It was an unbroken bond of absolute trust between a grandfather and his grandson, something no imposter could possibly know. I reached the oak door of the guest bedroom where my housekeeper had left the traumatized boy to rest. I turned the brass handle and pushed the door open. The room was dark. The velvet blackout curtains were drawn tightly shut, blocking out the morning sun. The air was perfectly still. I scanned the room. The bed in the center was undisturbed. I could hear the faint sound of shallow breathing coming from the far corner. I walked quietly across the carpet. I looked down near the edge of the wooden bed frame. Tucked deep into the dark, narrow shadow between the wall and the bed was the boy. He was curled into a tight, defensive ball. Arms were wrapped protectively around his head. He was violently trembling. The sheer fear radiating from his battered body was heartbreaking to witness. He looked like a prisoner of war bracing for another round of brutal interrogation. I felt a sharp ache in my knees as I lowered myself down onto the floor. I ignored the physical discomfort of my 71-year-old joints. I sat cross-legged on the carpet, positioning myself just a few feet away from where he was hiding in the dark shadows. I did not try to reach out and touch him. I knew from the horrific incident with Monica at the precinct that any physical contact would trigger a panic attack. I needed to speak to him in our secret language. I needed to bypass the profound trauma that had stolen his voice. I took a deep, steadying breath. I slowly reached my right hand out toward the wooden leg of the bed frame. I kept my movements deliberate and visible. I balled my hand into a loose fist. I knocked twice against the wood. The sound was sharp and clear in the quiet room. The boy instantly flinched at the sudden noise, pulling his knees even tighter against his bruised chest. I did not move. I pursed my lips and whistled a soft, familiar 2-note melody. The same melody I used in the dark closet during that terrible hurricane 4 years ago. The boy suddenly stopped trembling. His ragged breathing hitched and then slowed down completely. The silence in the room was deafening. I slowly raised my right hand into the sliver of light filtering under the door. I held up my thumb, holding it steady. I waited. Seconds felt like hours. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs. Then agonizingly, a tiny bruised hand emerged from the dark shadows under the bed. His fingers were shaking violently. He raised his small hand into the light and mirrored my gesture. He gave me a trembling thumbs up. Tears blurred my vision. An overwhelming mixture of relief and sorrow crashed over me. I slowly reached both arms out into the darkness. This time he did not flinch. He did not bite. He did not fight back. He practically threw his battered body forward, crawling out from under the bed and collapsing directly into my open arms. I wrapped my arms around his small, trembling frame, pulling him tightly against my chest. I buried my face in his sandy blonde hair, holding him, as if my very life depended on it. He buried his tear-soaked face deep into my collarbone, gripping the fabric of my shirt with desperate strength. His small shoulders heaved with silent sobs. He had been locked away, tortured, and replaced. But he remembered. He remembered his pop-pop. He pulled his head back just enough to look me in the eyes. His throat worked silently for a moment, as he fought against the psychological barrier that kept him mute for who knows how long. Then his parched lips parted. His voice was nothing more than a raspy, broken whisper, but the words echoed in the quiet room like a deafening thunderclap. "Pop, Pop," he whimpered, his eyes wide with sheer terror. "Mommy sold me." My blood turned to ice. My blood turned to ice. The boy trembling in my arms had just confirmed the most monstrous reality a human mind could fathom. My son and daughter-in-law had sold him. I held my real grandson tightly against my chest, rocking him back and forth. I promised I would never let anyone take him away again. I stayed in the dark guest room until his ragged breathing leveled into a deep sleep. I laid his battered body gently on the mattress and pulled the blankets up to his chin. I walked out, locking the door firmly behind me. I moved down the hallway with terrifying mechanical precision. If I allowed myself to feel the homicidal rage swirling inside my chest, I would have driven directly to Preston's house to beat the truth out of him. But brute force would only give them the legal upper hand and time to cover their tracks. I needed to completely destroy them legally, financially, and utterly. I walked into the living room where my housekeeper was watching the imposter play a video game. I forced a warm smile. I told Mrs. Gable I was heading to the country club for golf with business associates. I instructed her to keep both boys inside. She nodded, completely unaware of the nightmare unfolding. I grabbed my golf bag, making sure the imposter saw me leave. I loaded the clubs into my truck, but I did not drive to the country club. I steered my truck directly toward the towering skyscrapers of the downtown financial district. I was going to see Richard Caldwell. Richard was my ruthless corporate attorney. He had spent 30 years dismantling rival firms, orchestrating hostile takeovers, and burying corrupt executives. He was a certified shark in a custom-tailored suit. I bypassed his assistants and walked straight into his corner office, dropping my coat onto his leather sofa. Richard looked up from his mahogany desk, surprised by my unannounced appearance. His professional smile faded when he saw my cold expression. He closed his laptop. I sat down and laid out the entire horrific story from start to finish. I told him about the police call the birthmark, the bruised boy hiding under the desk, and the impossible story about a brain-damaged twin named Julian. I told him about the deadly peanut allergy, the violent reaction to Monica, and the chilling 4 words my real grandson had just whispered. Richard sat perfectly still. For a man who had seen the absolute darkest sides of corporate greed, he looked genuinely stunned. The color drained from his sharp face. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, letting out a heavy sigh. When he looked back up, the shock in his eyes had been replaced by a cold, calculating fury. He told me that my son had orchestrated an elaborate human trafficking operation and committed massive financial fraud against my estate. Richard immediately shifted into war mode. He reached for his secure desk phone and told me we were not going to rely on the local police just yet. The local cops were too slow and too easily manipulated by wealthy families. We needed airtight, undeniable proof before we triggered a federal investigation. Within 10 minutes, Richard secretly retained the services of an elite cyber investigator and a specialized forensic accountant. They were tasked with immediately tearing into Preston's private bank records, offshore accounts, and encrypted digital communications. We needed to follow the $5 million money trail he was trying to secure from my generational trust fund, but financial records were only half of the battle. We needed absolute biological proof to confirm the identity of the two boys living under my roof. Richard handed me a sealed, sterile medical evidence kit. He instructed me to covertly gather DNA samples from both children. I drove back to my house, moving with the quiet stealth of a ghost. I parked my truck quietly and slipped through the side entrance. I heard the loud sounds of the television coming from the living room, where the imposter boy was deeply engrossed in his games. I crept silently up the grand staircase and slipped directly into the private guest bathroom that the imposter had been using for the past 2 weeks. My heart hammered against my ribs as I carefully opened his toiletry bag. I pulled out his bright blue plastic toothbrush. I slid it gently into the sterile evidence bag Richard had provided, sealing it tightly shut, one sample secured. I placed the bag into my jacket pocket and walked down the hall to the isolated west wing of the house. I unlocked the heavy oak door and slipped inside the darkened bedroom. The real Liam was still sleeping soundly on the bed, his bruised hands clutching the thick comforter. I approached him with agonizing care. I gently stroked his sandy blonde hair, whispering soft, reassuring words so he would not wake up in a panic. With trembling fingers, I carefully isolated a single loose strand of hair resting against the white cotton pillowcase. I gently pulled it free, making sure the microscopic root follicle remained completely intact. I placed the fragile strand of hair into a second sterile bag and sealed it. I walked back down the grand staircase and handed both sealed evidence bags to a private, trusted medical courier waiting for me in an unmarked car at the end of my driveway. The courier promised expedited emergency laboratory processing. We would have the undeniable genetic truth within 24 hours. I walked back inside my quiet estate, feeling absolute control settling over my mind. The trap was officially set. I poured a glass of ice water and sat down in the leather chair in my private study. I needed to maintain the delicate illusion that I was still the generous grandfather rushing to save his sick relative. Right on cue, my cell phone vibrated violently on the polished desk. The caller identification displayed Monica's name. I took a deep breath, smoothing out my voice, and answered the call. "Hello, Monica," I said, my tone perfectly warm and normal. "Oh, hi, Dad." Her voice floated through the speaker, dripping with a sickeningly fake sweetness. She sounded like a devoted mother checking in on her child. "I am so sorry to bother you on a weekend," she cooed, "but Preston and I are just so terribly anxious about little Julian. We wanted to make sure he was resting comfortably, and we just wanted to ask if you had a chance to speak with your bankers yet about the clinic transfer funds." The sheer audacity of her greed made my blood boil. She had sold my flesh and blood to monsters, and now she was politely calling to collect her payday. I gripped the wooden armrest of my chair. I stared out the large bay window at the dark storm clouds gathering rapidly over the distant tree line. I forced a reassuring smile onto my face. I kept my voice incredibly soft and completely steady. "Do not worry about a single thing," I smiled into the phone. "Everything is in motion, my dear." I hung up the phone and placed it very gently on my wooden desk. Everything was in motion. I spent the weekend playing the part of the generous patriarch. I smiled at the imposter boy. I sat with the real Liam, reassuring him with our secret knocks. Every second felt like walking over broken glass. I had to suppress the burning urge to march over to Preston's house and tear him apart with my bare hands. But I am a man who builds empires. I know that absolute destruction requires patience and an airtight structural foundation. I needed undeniable proof before I dropped the heavy hammer. The agonizing wait finally ended the next morning. The heavy rain had cleared, leaving a pale gray sky hanging over my sprawling estate. I was sitting in my private study nursing a cup of black coffee when I saw a sleek black town car pull past the wrought iron gates of my driveway. It was Richard Caldwell. My corporate attorney stepped out of the vehicle looking completely exhausted. His usually impeccable suit was slightly wrinkled, and he carried a thick manila envelope along with a heavy leather briefcase. I met him at the oak doors of my study and ushered him inside, turning the brass lock until it clicked securely into place. Richard did not offer a polite greeting. He simply walked over to my desk and placed the manila envelope down in front of me. His face was grim, his jaw clenched tight. "The expedited laboratory results have arrived, Harrison," he said, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. "I suggest you sit down before you read them." I did not sit down. I grabbed the manila envelope and tore open the sealed flap. I pulled out the crisp white laboratory reports. The medical terminology was dense, but my eyes scanned rapidly down to the final conclusive paragraphs. The laboratory had meticulously compared the genetic markers from the single strand of hair I took from the traumatized boy against the DNA extracted from the blue plastic toothbrush used by the healthy boy. Both samples were then compared directly against my own genetic profile. I read the first conclusion. The traumatized, bruised child hiding in my guest room, the boy Preston and Monica adamantly claimed was a deformed secret twin named Julian, was a 99.9% genetic match to me. I was my true biological flesh and blood. He was the real Liam. I forced my trembling eyes to read the second paragraph. The healthy, energetic boy who had been sleeping in my house for the past 2 weeks. The boy who possessed the exact same hazel eyes and the identical crescent-shaped birthmark had absolutely zero genetic relation to me. I was a complete biological stranger. He was an incredibly convincing physical duplicate, a literal imposter, brought into my home to seamlessly replace my grandson. The heavy printed papers slipped from my trembling fingers and scattered across the surface of my desk. The sheer magnitude of their deception hit me like a physical blow to the chest. My son had not merely lied about a medical condition. He had actively removed his own flesh and blood from my life and seamlessly inserted a counterfeit child into my home. He had looked me right in the eyes and sold me a counterfeit reality, assuming my aging eyes and lingering grief would blind me to the truth. I slumped down heavily into my leather chair. My lungs felt tight, struggling to pull in enough oxygen. "Why, Richard?" I whispered, my voice cracking under the immense weight of the betrayal. Why would they go through such a monstrous, elaborate, theatrical deception? What could possibly drive a father to replace his own son? Richard did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached for the heavy metal clasps of his leather briefcase. He snapped them open and pulled out a second massive file folder. This one was thick, overflowing with printed digital spreadsheets, encrypted bank records, and highlighted financial ledgers. "This is the second part of the puzzle," Harrison Richard said, sliding the massive file across the desk toward me. My forensic accountant and the cyber investigator worked continuously through the entire weekend. They managed to successfully breach Preston's highly encrypted offshore accounts and his hidden digital communication ledgers. What they found goes far beyond simple reckless spending or a few bad investments. I pulled the heavy folder closer and opened it. Pages upon pages of massive wire transfers, offshore shell companies, and aggressive cryptocurrency transactions stared back at me. Richard began to expertly break down the highly complex financial nightmare my son had secretly created. Preston was not just living a lavish lifestyle beyond his means. He was a degenerate, compulsive gambler playing in incredibly high-stakes, illicit arenas. He had entangled himself with a dangerous underground gambling syndicate. He had been borrowing massive sums of illicit money to cover his catastrophic compounding losses. When the syndicate cut off his credit, Preston became desperate. I used his executive position at the investment fund to secretly embezzle millions of dollars from his own wealthy clients, hoping to win back the massive deficit. He failed catastrophically. He lost every single stolen penny. I stared at the staggering highlighted numbers on the financial spreadsheets. The total deficit was not a few $100,000. It was an apocalyptic sum. Preston had embezzled exactly $15 million. He had dug a financial grave so deep there was absolutely no conventional way out. Richard leaned forward, resting his hands flat on my desk. The cyber investigator intercepted highly encrypted messages sent to Preston's personal device 3 weeks ago. Richard explained, his tone dead serious. The syndicate discovered the massive embezzlement. They gave Preston and Monica an absolute non-negotiable ultimatum. They were ordered to pay back the full $15 million within 1 month. If they failed to deliver the funds, the syndicate explicitly promised to brutally murder them both. A chilling silence fell over the soundproofed study. I stared blindly at the terrifying financial ledgers scattered across my desk. My mind was rapidly connecting the dark, horrifying dots. The custom Ferrari, the expensive designer clothes, the luxurious vacations. It was all a desperate, manic facade to pretend everything was perfectly normal, while the clock ticked down on their lives. I looked up at Richard, my heart pounding. I understand why they came begging me for the $5 million from the generational trust fund. They are desperate for liquid cash. But $5 million is not $15 million. It does not even cover half of their massive blood debt. I looked back down at the crisp white DNA results resting beside the horrific financial ledgers, the bruised, traumatized boy hiding in my guest room, the healthy, identical imposter eating breakfast in my kitchen. The math did not add up. If they needed $15 million to save their own lives, why would they go through the incredible trouble and massive expense of replacing my grandson with a fake child? How does introducing a counterfeit kid into my house solve a $15 million blood debt? What sick, demonic transaction were they truly planning? I needed to discover what sick, demonic transaction they were truly planning. Richard packed up his forensic files and left my estate with a solemn promise to begin preparing the necessary federal legal documents immediately. I locked the heavy mahogany doors of my private study and sat alone in the stifling silence of my massive house. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out the black digital receiver that my cyber investigator had seamlessly linked to the audio bugs hidden inside Preston's Ferrari and Monica's handbag. I placed a pair of noise-canceling headphones over my ears and turned the volume dial up. For the first few agonizing hours, I heard absolutely nothing but the ambient background noise of their luxurious house. I heard the clinking of crystal wine glasses, the muted hum of a massive television, and their occasional sharp, irritated whispers complaining bitterly about my sudden involvement in their lives. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair, staring blankly at the dark wall as the evening stretched painfully into the dead of night. I drank cup after cup of bitter black coffee just to keep my exhausted body awake and alert. My heart ached with a profound, suffocating grief, but my mind remained violently focused and remarkably clear. I was patiently waiting for the inevitable slip-up. I was waiting for the raw, terrifying truth to bleed out when they thought absolutely no one was listening. Just past midnight, the steady audio feed suddenly crackled to life with the distinct heavy thud of a car door slamming shut. Preston had retreated to the soundproofed cabin of his Italian sports car to make a highly private phone call. I leaned forward, resting my elbows heavily on the polished wood of my desk, pressing the soft headphones much tighter against my ears. I heard the deep, aggressive rumble of the Ferrari engine turning over, followed by the rhythmic clicking of the climate control system. Then I heard Preston manually dial a long sequence of numbers on his encrypted mobile device. The phone rang 3 times before a cold, synthesized voice answered on the other end of the line. The distorted voice immediately demanded a thorough status update regarding the pending delivery of the merchandise. Preston's voice trembled slightly as he spoke, betraying the suffocating terror he was desperately trying to hide behind his usual arrogant facade. He respectfully addressed the mysterious man on the other end of the line simply as the broker. As I listened intently to their chilling conversation, the absolute darkest pieces of the demonic puzzle finally slammed violently into place. Preston and Monica had not merely borrowed money from a violent underground gambling syndicate and lost it all. When they realized they could never legally repay the massive $15 million deficit, they had frantically searched the deepest, darkest corners of the illicit dark web for a highly lucrative immediate bailout. They had successfully located a high-level black market human trafficker who catered exclusively to the most depraved desires of the global elite. The ruthless broker casually mentioned that his primary client, an eccentric, deeply sick billionaire, living entirely off the grid in a heavily fortified overseas compound, had very specific and uncompromising biological demands. This unseen wealthy monster did not just want any random child snatched from the streets. He demanded absolute flawless genetic perfection. He wanted a child with an exceptionally high intelligence quotient, a completely flawless medical history, and striking, bright blue eyes. He was willing to pay an astronomical premium for a young, healthy child who fit those exact rigorous parameters perfectly. He was willing to pay exactly $15 million in untraceable cryptocurrency. My blood literally froze solid in my veins as the horrific, agonizing realization washed over me. Preston and Monica had looked at their own beautiful, brilliant, innocent son and saw absolutely nothing but a walking, breathing, winning lottery ticket. They had willfully and deliberately sold their own flesh and blood to a monstrous global predator just to clear their illicit gambling debts and maintain their superficial lifestyle. The sheer monstrous cruelty of their transaction completely defied all bounds of normal human comprehension. But the black market broker was entirely ruthless and aggressively demanded to know exactly why there was a sudden, unexpected delay in the final product delivery. Preston frantically scrambled to explain the complicated logistical nightmare they had been navigating for the past 2 weeks. He nervously explained to the trafficker that they could not simply allow my real grandson to suddenly vanish without a trace. If Liam went missing, the police would immediately launch a massive, highly publicized search operation that would draw unwanted federal attention. More importantly, I would instantly freeze the continuous flow of cash I was blindly providing to them. They needed a flawless distraction. They needed a physical placeholder to occupy the empty space in their home until my weak heart finally gave out, and I died leaving them my entire $50 million fortune. So they orchestrated a sickeningly elaborate contingency plan. They scoured the absolute lowest impoverished sectors of the city, searching for a desperate temporary solution. They eventually found a severely addicted, impoverished mother living in a dilapidated roadside motel who happened to have a young, neglected son with the exact same sandy blonde hair and bright hazel eyes as my grandson. Preston callously admitted to the broker that they had purchased this innocent look-alike child for $50,000 in untraceable cash. They forcefully removed him from his miserable environment, gave him an expensive haircut, dressed him in my grandson's designer clothes, and seamlessly dropped him into my house. They treated human lives like cheap disposable spare parts, perfectly willing to sacrifice 2 innocent children just to save their own worthless skins. The absolute depravity of their actions made me nauseous. I gripped the wooden edge of my desk simply to stop my hands from shaking violently. I took a slow, deep, deliberate breath, forcing my lungs to expand against the crushing, heavy weight of the terrifying reality I had just uncovered. The audio feed crackled again, producing a sharp burst of static interference as Preston shifted nervously in his expensive leather car seat. The broker's distorted voice cut cleanly through the static, warning Preston that the overseas client was growing incredibly impatient, and that the massive $15 million offshore transfer would be permanently canceled if the product was not secured immediately. The broker explicitly reminded Preston that the violent gambling syndicate was eagerly waiting for their money, and they would not hesitate to brutally execute Monica if the final deadline was missed. Preston swallowed hard, his voice echoing with raw, unadulterated desperation. He assured the ruthless trafficker that the minor complication had been completely resolved. The old man completely bought the sick twin's story. Preston promised, his words dripping with a disgusting, arrogant confidence. He thinks we are just transferring Julian to a specialized medical clinic. The audio feed buzzed with another short burst of heavy static before Preston delivered the final chilling confirmation. We will deliver the real kid back to you tomorrow night at Pier 4. Have the offshore account ready. The chilling finality of those words hung in the suffocating silence of my private study. I ripped the noise-canceling headphones off my ears and threw them onto the mahogany desk. A visceral, homicidal rage completely consumed my mind, making my hands shake with a sudden, terrifying intensity. My own flesh and blood, the son I had raised and protected, had just finalized the sale of my innocent grandson to a ruthless international black market syndicate. For a few dangerous seconds, the logical structural engineer inside me vanished. I wanted to drive to their lavish estate, kick down their custom front doors, and beat the absolute life out of my son with my own bare hands. I wanted to make him feel a fraction of the sheer terror he had inflicted upon an innocent child. I stood up and paced across the expensive Persian rug, my breathing heavy and erratic like a caged animal preparing to strike. But giving in to blind violence would only result in my immediate arrest, and it would leave the real Liam completely defenseless. I forced myself to stop pacing. I closed my eyes and took a long, deep breath, visualizing the massive steel foundations I used to build for skyscrapers. A solid foundation requires absolute precision, meticulous planning, and not reckless emotion that could easily compromise the entire operation. I had exactly 18 hours before the exchange at Pier Number 4. I needed a masterstroke that would obliterate their entire existence while keeping my grandson perfectly safe. I picked up my secure mobile phone with steady hands and immediately dialed Richard Caldwell, breaking the late-night silence. I told him to wake up his most aggressive contacts in the federal government. I did not care what time it was. During my 40 years of building a commercial logistics and construction empire, I had quietly accumulated a massive arsenal of political and financial favors. I had heavily funded the successful campaigns of prominent district attorneys, local judges, and state senators across the eastern seaboard. I had provided vital logistical infrastructure for massive federal initiatives during times of severe economic crisis. I had never once called in a single favor for my personal benefit. Today, I was calling in absolutely all of them at once. Richard connected me directly to Detective Bradley and a high-ranking commander within the Federal Human Trafficking Task Force. I laid out the entire horrific operation in clinical, precise detail. I provided the intercepted dark web audio files, the concrete DNA evidence, and the exact time and location of the planned transaction. The federal commander initially hesitated, citing the complex bureaucratic protocols required to mobilize a fully armed tactical team on such incredibly short notice. I bypassed his hesitation instantly. I calmly informed him that I personally knew the state governor and the regional director of the bureau. I promised him that if he did not have a fully equipped tactical unit waiting in the shadows at Pier Number 4, by tomorrow evening I would unleash a media and political firestorm that would end his career. The commander heard the absolute lethal conviction in my voice. The bureaucratic red tape that usually stalled massive federal operations was instantly vaporized without another word of protest. A massive joint federal and local strike force was immediately authorized and secretly mobilized, with the federal trap securely in place. I needed to ensure that Preston and Monica walked willingly right into the steel jaws of the snare. I needed to blind them with their own unadulterated greed. I waited until exactly 9 in the morning before I dialed Preston's personal cell phone. He answered on the second ring, his voice tight with anxiety from his dark web negotiations the previous night. I completely masked my burning hatred. I draped my tone in the soft, weary sorrow of a grieving grandfather who had finally accepted a tragic reality. I told him that I had spent the entire night reflecting on our conversation. I told him that I had formally authorized the emergency release of the massive generational trust funds, despite my earlier reservations. I explicitly stated that a certified check for $5 million was sitting right on my desk, ready for him. I could practically hear the massive wave of relief washing over his treacherous mind. He eagerly thanked me, calling me the ultimate savior of their struggling family. But then I smoothly laid out my single non-negotiable condition. I told Preston that I needed to spend one last quiet afternoon alone with Julian before they transferred him to the specialized clinic in Geneva. I said I wanted to say a proper private goodbye to the grandson I had just met. Preston hesitated for a fraction of a second. I knew he was terrified that the real Liam might somehow expose the deception if left alone with me for too long. But the overwhelming temptation of a guaranteed $5 million payout was entirely too strong for a degenerate gambler to resist. He quickly agreed to drop the boy off at my estate after lunch, stating they would return to collect him and the massive check just before sunset. The trap was perfectly set. Early that afternoon, the real Liam sat quietly on the thick carpet of my soundproofed study. I had instructed my housekeeper to keep the healthy imposter completely occupied in the West Wing home theater so we would not be interrupted. I knelt down on the floor next to my true grandson. He was still covered in faded purple bruises, and he still refused to speak a single word aloud, but the sheer terror in his hazel eyes had faded slightly. He instinctively knew he was completely safe within the heavy walls of my private study, far away from the monsters. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small black digital wristwatch. I had my security team rush deliver it earlier that morning. It looked like a cheap, generic plastic toy, but it was actually a military-grade encrypted global positioning tracker. I gently took his small, trembling hand and fastened the soft rubber strap securely around his thin, bruised wrist. I tapped twice on the wooden floorboard and whistled our soft, secret two-note melody. He immediately looked up at me and mirrored the gesture, holding up his tiny thumb. I leaned in close and looked directly into his eyes. I kept my voice incredibly soft, but filled with absolute, unyielding confidence. I whispered that Pop was going to play a serious game of hide-and-seek with the bad guys tonight. I told him that he had to be incredibly brave and go with his parents when they came to pick him up. I saw a flash of panic cross his face, but I gently squeezed his small shoulder. I promised him that no matter how dark it got, the special watch would guide me straight to him. I swore on my life that I would be right behind him, waiting in the shadows to bring him home. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he slowly gave me a firm thumbs up. The late afternoon sun began to dip slowly below the dense tree line, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns of my estate. I stood alone in the center of the grand marble foyer, silently watching the antique mahogany clock tick away the agonizing seconds. Every swing of the heavy pendulum felt like a physical hammer striking against my chest. I had spent the last few grueling hours playing mindless games with the healthy imposter, pretending everything was perfectly cheerful. Meanwhile, my true flesh and blood sat quietly in my soundproofed study, anxiously waiting for his monstrous parents to return. The sheer psychological toll of maintaining this grandfatherly facade was exhausting, but I could not afford to make a single mistake. Exactly at dusk, the heavy wrought iron gates at the far end of my driveway swung open. Preston's custom black Ferrari crawled slowly up the winding cobblestone path, stopping aggressively right in front of the main entrance. I took one final deep breath, burying every ounce of my violent, homicidal rage beneath a thick, impenetrable layer of sorrow. The heavy front doors creaked open. Preston and Monica stepped cautiously into the bright foyer. They were dressed in dark, somber clothing, deliberately attempting to look like devastated, grieving parents. Monica immediately rushed forward across the marble floor. She threw her arms dramatically around my neck, burying her face deep into my shoulder. She let out a series of loud, theatrical sobs that sounded incredibly convincing. She thanked me profusely for generously saving her precious little boy and promised that God would bless me for my boundless kindness. I stood completely rigid like a stone pillar, fighting the overwhelming visceral urge to wrap my fingers directly around her throat. I told her I was simply doing what any loving grandfather would do. Preston stepped up beside his weeping wife, looking around the foyer with eager, calculating eyes. He quickly asked me if Julian was ready for the journey. I nodded, playing my part perfectly, and called out toward the private study. The heavy doors opened, and my housekeeper gently guided the bruised, traumatized child out into the entryway. The real Liam was wearing a heavy winter coat that seemed to swallow his fragile frame. He kept his head bowed low, but I could easily see his small, battered body trembling violently the exact second he laid his eyes on his parents. Monica gracefully knelt down on the floor and reached out as if to hug him affectionately. However, she deliberately kept her manicured hands a safe distance away from his mouth, clearly remembering the brutal bite she received at the police station. She whispered sweet, deceptive promises about taking him to a wonderful, magical hospital where he would finally be cured. The boy did not look at her or acknowledge her false affection. He looked entirely at me. I walked deliberately over to the sleek wooden console table near the front door. I picked up a thick, sealed white envelope and held it out toward my son. I told Preston that the certified check for exactly $5 million was secured inside. I explicitly told him that the funds were fully cleared and ready for immediate international transfer directly to the Swiss clinic. Preston reached out instantly. His hands were shaking so violently with unadulterated raw greed that he almost dropped the envelope onto the marble floor. He clutched it fiercely against his chest, as if holding a desperate lifeline. He did not bother to tear the seal and verify the contents. The blinding desperation of his massive blood debt had completely short-circuited his rational thought process. He thanked me profusely, his voice cracking with genuine relief. He swore he would call me the second they arrived at the facility. Preston quickly stuffed the white envelope deep into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket. His entire demeanor instantly shifted from tragic sorrow to frantic haste. He reached out aggressively and grabbed the real Liam by the shoulder, gripping the boy's bruised flesh far too tightly. He practically dragged the terrified, stumbling child toward the open front doors, not giving him a single solitary moment to say a proper, loving goodbye to me. I took a sudden, sharp step forward, my protective instincts flaring dangerously hot in my chest, but right before I could intervene, the boy suddenly stopped, resisting the rough pull. He turned his head and looked back at me over his shoulder. His eyes were wide with absolute terror, but he slowly raised his tiny trembling hand into the air. He tucked his fingers inward and formed a perfect, deliberate thumbs up. It was our deeply held secret signal. He remembered my quiet promise from earlier that afternoon. He knew I was going to play a serious game with the bad guys tonight, and that he needed to be incredibly brave just a little while longer. I seamlessly mirrored the subtle gesture, pressing my own thumb firmly against my leg, where only his eyes could see it. I gave him a slow, solid, reassuring nod. Preston impatiently jerked the boy forward, pulling his small frame out into the fading twilight. Monica followed closely behind them, pulling her coat tight and not looking back once at the man she was currently betraying. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut, closing with a loud, definitive thud. I walked silently over to the tall front bay windows and pulled back the sheer white curtain just an inch. I watched the glowing red taillights of the custom Ferrari illuminate the wet cobblestone driveway. The sleek sports car accelerated rapidly, spinning its tires as it sped away. They were gone. I stood motionless by the tall window, ensuring they were completely out of sight. The grieving grandfather mask melted away, leaving cold resolve. I walked purposefully down the central hallway with the precision of an apex predator who had just cornered his prey. I pushed open the steel door leading into my private garage. Parked in the shadows was my heavy armored sport utility vehicle. The engine was already running, emitting a low, powerful rumble. I climbed into the driver's seat and adjusted the rearview mirror. Sitting quiet in the back seat were two imposing men. Richard Caldwell, my ruthless corporate attorney, was reviewing digital legal warrants on his tablet. Sitting beside him was a man dressed in dark tactical combat gear. He was the senior commander for the Federal Human Trafficking Task Force. He looked up from his secure communications device and met my eyes in the mirror. He gave me a single curt nod, indicating that his massive undercover strike teams were fully armed in position and awaiting my signal. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my mobile phone. I opened the global positioning application securely linked to the digital watch I had strapped to my grandson's wrist earlier. A detailed satellite map filled the screen. A bright red digital dot was blinking steadily, moving rapidly down the western interstate highway. I watched the red dot merge onto the exit route, leading toward the abandoned shipping district near the dark waterfront. It was moving exactly toward Pier Number 4, just as the dark web audio had promised. I placed the phone firmly onto the dashboard mount, locking the tracking route onto the navigation screen. I shifted the heavy vehicle into drive and securely gripped the leather steering wheel tightly. "Let us go hunt, now," I said. The drive toward the industrial shipping district felt like descending into the absolute depths of a freezing concrete hell. The torrential rain battered the heavy armored chassis of my sport utility vehicle with a relentless, deafening rhythm. I guided the vehicle through a maze of decaying warehouses and rusted chain-link fences. The streetlights in this forgotten sector of the city had burned out decades ago, leaving nothing but suffocating darkness. I killed the headlights a full block away from the designated exchange point, navigating the final stretch using only the ambient glow of the distant city skyline, reflecting off the flooded asphalt. I eased the heavy vehicle behind a massive stack of rotting shipping containers, cutting the engine but keeping the auxiliary power engaged. The sudden silence inside the cabin was heavy and tense. Richard Caldwell sat in the back seat, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning the bleak surroundings. Beside him, the Federal Human Trafficking Task Force commander monitored a glowing tactical display. He quietly confirmed over his encrypted radio that dozens of heavily armed agents were already slipping into position, forming an invisible perimeter around the entire pier. We were completely enveloped in the shadows, waiting for the monsters to arrive. I reached into the storage compartment between the front seats and pulled out a pair of heavy military-grade night vision binoculars. I rolled down my driver's side window just a fraction, letting the freezing wind and biting rain slice into the warm cabin. I pressed the cold rubber cups of the binoculars against my face and adjusted the focal dial. The pitch-black shipping pier suddenly burst into stark illuminated shades of bright tactical green. Pier Number 4 was a desolate expanse of cracked concrete, bordered by the churning dark waters of the harbor. Massive rusted cranes loomed overhead like skeletal giants, standing guard over the abandoned docks. Piles of discarded wooden pallets and twisted metal debris littered the ground, providing perfect blind spots for illicit transactions. My heart pounded against my ribs with a heavy, agonizing rhythm. Somewhere out there, in the freezing rain, my innocent flesh and blood was being transported toward an unimaginably horrific fate. I focused my breathing, drawing cold, damp air into my lungs to force my heart rate down. I needed absolute clinical focus. I scanned the empty expanse of the pier, watching the rain slash sideways across the concrete. We waited in the suffocating silence for 15 agonizing minutes. Suddenly, the stark green glow of the binoculars flared brightly as a set of headlights swept across the cracked pavement. A massive black unmarked cargo van rolled slowly onto the pier, its tires splashing through deep puddles of muddy water. The vehicle had no license plates, and its rear windows were heavily tinted. It crawled to a stop near the edge of the water, keeping its engine idling. Two massive, heavily armed men stepped out of the front doors. They wore dark tactical vests and carried submachine guns openly slung across their broad chests. They took up defensive positions on either side of the van, scanning the perimeter with professional, predatory caution. A few moments later, the distinct aggressive roar of a high-performance engine shattered the ambient noise of the storm. Preston's custom matte black Ferrari sped onto the pier, its low chassis navigating the uneven concrete with reckless haste. He slammed on the brakes, parking the luxury sports car just 20 yards away from the idling cargo van. Through the magnified lenses, I could clearly see the interior of the sports car. Monica was sitting perfectly still in the heated passenger seat. She pulled down the sun visor mirror and began casually reapplying her expensive lipstick, completely unbothered by the monstrous transaction about to take place right outside her window. She was selling her child to violent criminals, and her only concern was maintaining her flawless makeup. Preston threw open his door and stepped out into the freezing rain. He did not bother opening an umbrella. He leaned into the back seat and aggressively yanked my real grandson out into the storm. The boy was still wearing the oversized winter coat, holding his small arms tightly against his chest to ward off the biting cold. He was visibly sobbing, his tiny shoulders shaking violently as the rain instantly soaked his sandy blonde hair. Preston did not offer a single word of comfort. He kept a brutal iron grip on the boy's fragile collarbone, dragging him forward across the wet pavement toward the armed men. The rear doors of the cargo van swung open, revealing a third man stepping out into the storm. He was the broker. He wore a long, expensive trench coat that completely shielded him from the weather. The broker walked forward carrying a sleek silver metal briefcase. He stopped a few feet away from Preston and tossed the heavy briefcase onto the hood of the Ferrari. Preston eagerly scrambled forward, leaving my terrified grandson standing alone in the rain. Preston fumbled with the metal latches, popping the case open to reveal a glowing digital ledger. He stared at the screen, verifying the massive $15 million offshore cryptocurrency transfer. I watched through those glowing green lenses as a massive, disgusting smile of pure, unadulterated relief spread across Preston's wet face. The crushing weight of his catastrophic gambling debt had just been magically erased. He had secured his luxurious lifestyle and his absolute freedom. He slammed the metal briefcase shut and clutched it fiercely against his chest. The broker gestured impatiently toward the shivering child standing on the wet concrete. Preston did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. He turned around and violently shoved his own flesh and blood toward the heavily armed men. The brutal force of the shove sent my fragile grandson stumbling forward. The boy lost his footing and fell hard onto his hands and knees, scraping his skin against the harsh gravel. He looked back at his father, crying out in sheer terror. Preston simply turned his back on the child and walked quickly toward the driver's side door of his expensive sports car, ready to drive away and leave his son to a lifetime of unimaginable horrors. The federal task force sitting in the back seat of my vehicle leaned forward slightly. He placed his hand on my shoulder. His voice was a tight, professional whisper. "Mr. Mitchell, we have visual confirmation of the exchange and the armed hostiles. We are holding positions. I am waiting for your final signal to initiate the breach." I lowered the heavy night vision binoculars, placing them carefully onto the passenger seat. I looked at the commander in the rearview mirror. My mind was perfectly clear, stripped of all hesitation. I did not just give the man a simple verbal confirmation. I reached for the handle of my door. I pushed the heavy armored metal open and stepped out into the freezing torrential rain. I closed the door solidly behind me, ignoring the biting wind that whipped my coat around my legs. I turned my collar up and began walking deliberately across the flooded street, heading toward the illuminated pier. I stepped into the harsh, glaring beams of the black cargo van headlights. The sudden illumination cast long, terrifying shadows across the desolate shipping pier. Preston was standing near the hood of his custom Ferrari, having just shoved my terrified grandson toward the armed men. The sound of my heavy boots crunching on the wet gravel cut through the rhythmic drumming of the storm. Preston turned around sharply. The massive, disgusting smile of relief on his face instantly froze. His eyes widened in absolute, unadulterated shock as he recognized his 71-year-old father standing in the middle of a highly illegal black market exchange. His jaw dropped open. The expensive black umbrella he was holding slipped from his fingers. It clattered loudly against the wet concrete and rolled away into a dark puddle. He stared at me as if I were a ghost that had just risen from the grave. He took a shaky step backward. "Dad. Dad," he stammered, his voice cracking with pure disbelief. "What are you doing here?" The sheer absurdity of his pathetic question hung in the heavy, freezing air. He honestly believed he had outsmarted me. He honestly believed his flawless, tragic lie about a sick twin brother had kept me perfectly sedated in my massive estate. He had absolutely no idea that I had been pulling the invisible strings of his destruction for the past 24 hours. The mysterious trafficker, wearing the long trench coat, quickly stepped back into the deep shadows of the idling van. He tightly clutched the silver metal briefcase containing the digital ledger. The sudden, unexpected appearance of an uninvited outsider made his security team incredibly nervous. The two massive, heavily armed guards instantly raised their tactical submachine guns. They aimed the dark, lethal barrels directly at my chest. They shouted aggressive commands, their rough voices ordering me to stop moving and get on the ground. But before their calloused fingers could even twitch against the metal triggers of their weapons, my carefully orchestrated masterstroke was finally unleashed. A blinding, apocalyptic wall of brilliant white light violently erupted from the skeletal cranes and the rusted rooftops of the surrounding abandoned warehouses. The suffocating darkness of the desolate pier was instantly obliterated, turning the freezing night into stark, undeniable day. The deafening, ear-piercing wail of federal sirens completely shattered the heavy rhythmic drumming of the torrential storm. Massive armored tactical vehicles screeched onto the cracked concrete from every single hidden access road, aggressively boxing in the custom Ferrari and the unmarked cargo van. Dozens of heavily armed federal task force agents flooded the pier from every single shadow. Bright red laser sights cut sharply through the driving rain, locking directly onto the chests of the black market traffickers. The commanding, booming voices of federal agents echoed through heavy megaphones, ordering absolutely everyone to drop their weapons and get down on the flooded ground. The violent criminals instantly realized they were hopelessly outgunned and completely surrounded. They dropped their submachine guns onto the wet pavement and raised their hands in defeat. They were immediately tackled by the tactical assault teams and pinned face down against the cold, unforgiving asphalt. Absolute, unadulterated chaos erupted across the entire shipping pier. The flashing red and blue lights of the federal cruisers reflected wildly off the deep puddles of muddy water. I stood perfectly still in the exact center of the blinding storm, an immovable pillar of cold, calculated justice. I watched with profound clinical satisfaction as tactical agents swarmed the sleek, matte black Ferrari. They aggressively ripped the passenger side door open. Monica was dragged out into the freezing, relentless rain. Her expensive designer clothing was instantly ruined as she was forcefully pushed down onto her knees in the dirty, freezing mud. She screamed hysterically, her voice shrill and entirely panicked. She thrashed against the federal agents, completely unable to comprehend how her luxurious, highly insulated life had just evaporated in the blink of an eye. Preston was violently forced down onto his knees by two massive armored operators. His hands were yanked roughly behind his back. The cold, terrifying reality of his absolute destruction was finally setting in. But his degenerate, gambling mind desperately tried to play one final pathetic hand. He locked his frantic, terrified eyes onto me. His face was pale, streaming with freezing rain and genuine tears of panic. He desperately twisted his body and reached into his tailored jacket pocket. He pulled out the thick, sealed white envelope I had handed to him just a few hours ago at my estate. He held the envelope high in the air, with trembling, desperate hands, treating it like a wholly impenetrable shield of innocence. He screamed over the deafening, chaotic blare of the federal sirens. He begged me to help him. He begged me to tell the heavily armed tactical agents that this was all a massive, catastrophic misunderstanding. He hysterically claimed he was simply taking his sick, disabled child to the specialized medical clinic in Switzerland, just like we had planned. He used the white envelope as his ultimate proof of legitimacy, entirely convinced that my $5 million certified check would validate his desperate, pathetic lies. I did not answer his pathetic, desperate, begging cries. I completely ignored the deafening sirens, the glaring strobe lights, and the frantic, aggressive shouting of the tactical agents securing the outer perimeter. I walked with deliberate, measured steps through the absolute chaos of the federal raid. The federal commander who had ridden in my armored vehicle recognized me instantly. He silently gestured for his armed men to lower their weapons and let me pass safely through their defensive line. I walked directly up to where my son was kneeling helplessly in the muddy, freezing water. He looked up at me with wide, pleading eyes, still desperately clutching the sealed white envelope in his shaking hands. I looked down at him with a cold, hollow emptiness. I did not feel any visceral anger anymore. I did not feel any paternal sorrow or regret. I only felt the deeply clinical satisfaction of finally excising a malignant, toxic tumor from my family tree. I reached down and violently snatched the thick white envelope right out of his trembling, desperate hands. Preston gasped loudly, his eyes darting frantically between me and the federal agents surrounding him. I deliberately tore the sealed top off the heavy paper. I reached inside and pulled out the thick stack of folded documents. I held them up directly in front of his face so he could see them perfectly clearly under the harsh, unforgiving glare of the tactical floodlights. It was not a certified cashier's check for $5 million. It was a crisp, highly detailed printout of the genetic DNA test results, undeniably proving that the bruised child he tried to sell tonight is my true biological grandson. And securely stapled directly beneath those damning medical results was a meticulously typed word-for-word transcript of his heavily encrypted dark web audio recording. The exact, undeniable conversation where he explicitly negotiated the sale of his own flesh and blood to an international trafficker to clear a massive gambling debt. Preston stared at the drenched papers in my hand. His dark eyes darted wildly across the bold black letters of the official laboratory header. I watched his dilated pupils tremble as his calculating brain finally processed the sheer catastrophic magnitude of what he was reading. He read the 99.9% genetic match that undeniably proved the identity of his own son. He read his own treacherous words, printed out line by agonizing line on the heavily encrypted dark web transcript. The absolute certainty of his flawless master plan violently shattered into a million irreparable pieces right in front of his face. All the arrogant confidence he had carried for the past 2 weeks completely drained from his shivering body. His jaw slackened. The thick white envelope slipped from his numb fingers and plastered itself to the flooded asphalt. He let out a low, guttural sound that was somewhere between a desperate gasp and a pathetic whimper. His legs simply gave out beneath him, unable to bear the crushing weight of his monumental failure. His knees buckled hard against the rough, wet concrete, tearing the expensive fabric of his tailored designer trousers. He collapsed forward, planting his bare hands deep into the freezing, muddy puddles to stop his face from hitting the ground. The heavy, relentless rain continued to batter his shaking shoulders, but he did not even try to stand back up. He was entirely broken. The terrifying reality of federal prison and the absolute permanent destruction of his luxurious, privileged life had finally severed his spine. To my immediate right, a sudden burst of hysterical screaming pierced cleanly through the rhythmic, deafening drumming of the storm. 3 heavily armored federal tactical agents had aggressively closed in on Monica. She was flailing wildly, her arms thrashing dangerously in the freezing rain as she desperately tried to push the massive armed operators away from her. She shrieked at the top of her lungs that she was a wealthy, respected woman of high society and that they had absolutely no legal right to touch her delicate skin. One of the veteran federal agents completely ignored her frantic, entitled protests. He grabbed her wrists with practiced mechanical efficiency and violently twisted her arms tightly behind her back. Monica let out a deafening wail of pure, unadulterated outrage as the heavy, cold steel handcuffs slapped harshly around her wrists, locking tightly into place with a sharp, definitive click. The tactical agent forcefully pushed her downward toward the ground to secure her completely. She instantly lost her balance and crashed incredibly hard into the dirty freezing sludge covering the abandoned pier. Her pristine beige designer coat and her incredibly expensive silk trousers were instantly soaked and permanently ruined by the thick, dark, disgusting mud. She sobbed uncontrollably, staring down in sheer horror at her filthy, muddy clothes and her tightly restrained hands. She was entirely unable to comprehend the simple, terrifying fact that her glorious days of country club brunches and limitless platinum credit cards were permanently over. She was no longer a beautiful, wealthy socialite, demanding royal treatment from the world. She was nothing more than a captured federal criminal covered in disgusting industrial filth. Preston slowly tilted his head upward, looking at me from the dark, dirty puddles. The driving rain washed the industrial dirt and the bitter tears across his pale, absolutely terrified face. He reached out with a trembling, muddy hand, desperately trying to grasp the dry hem of my winter coat. "Dad," he begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, incredibly pathetic whine. "You have to listen to me right now. I had absolutely no other choice in the matter. I owed them so much money. They were ruthless, violent, dangerous people. They were going to kill us without a second thought. They were going to brutally murder Monica and me if we did not pay them the $15 million immediately. I had to do it to save our own lives. You have to tell these federal agents to let us go. You have the immense power to make all of this disappear. Please, Dad, have mercy on me." I looked down at the pathetic, shivering creature kneeling helplessly at my feet. I did not feel a single drop of parental pity or sorrow. The deep, vast reservoir of unconditional, paternal love I once held for him had completely dried up, leaving behind absolutely nothing but cold, barren, unforgiving stone. I kept my voice incredibly low and remarkably steady, ensuring that every single sharp syllable cut cleanly through his frantic, pathetic sobbing. "You did not just sell your own son, Preston," I said, my words striking him like brutal physical blows. "You willfully sold your own eternal soul for a custom Ferrari and a prestigious country club membership. You gladly traded innocent human flesh just to maintain a shallow, pathetic illusion of immense wealth. You are a disgusting monster. And as of this exact moment, you are no longer my blood. I renounce you entirely." Preston let out a devastating, agonizing wail, dropping his face back down deep into the freezing mud. I did not waste another single second looking at his pathetic form. I stepped deliberately past his broken, kneeling body and walked directly toward the dark, unmarked cargo van. The real Liam was standing near the rear metal bumper, shivering uncontrollably in the freezing, relentless downpour. The heavy, oversized winter coat he wore was completely soaked through, clinging heavily to his bruised and battered frame. I walked quickly up to my terrified, innocent grandson and immediately stripped off my thick, dry, protective outer jacket. I wrapped the heavy, warm, waterproof fabric securely around his small, trembling shoulders, cocooning him safely from the biting, aggressive wind. I crouched down slowly and scooped his fragile, battered body up into my strong arms, holding him incredibly tightly against my chest. He instantly buried his cold, wet face deep into my neck, wrapping his bruised arms around me with desperate, clinging strength. I turned around and began walking deliberately back across the flooded concrete pier toward my waiting armored sport utility vehicle. As I calmly passed the long, flashing line of federal cruisers, two massive tactical agents were forcefully shoving Monica into the cramped plastic back seat of a highly secured police patrol car. She was weeping hysterically, her permanently ruined designer clothes dripping thick, dark mud directly onto the clean pavement. I paused for a brief, fleeting second right beside the open metal door of the police cruiser. I leaned in extremely close to her ear, completely ignoring the massive, chaotic storm raging wildly all around us. I kept my voice perfectly polite and incredibly sharp, cutting through her endless, obnoxious wailing. "Enjoy your long stay in federal prison," I whispered smoothly. "I hear they do not do luxury manicures there." She gasped in absolute horror as the heavy door slammed shut violently in her face, sealing her fate forever. I turned my back on them both for the absolute final time. I held my beautiful grandson tightly against my chest and walked away into the dark, freezing night, finally bringing him safely back home tonight.